We're obviously playing pretty aggressively, so let's play e4. Alright. And that's already stumped him. Okay, this is interesting. I don't know if he's planning to make a move at some point today, or he's doing his own speedrun. e6, there we go. Okay, so the French. Now, there's many lines against the French that are perfectly viable. And, you know, most of them start with d4. There are alternatives to d4. And there's a couple of sidelines here which are very interesting. Even the move queen e2 is quite interesting. The sideline to the French that is perhaps the most interesting at this level is the King's Indian attack. The King's Indian attack against the French, I would say for this rating range, if you fear the French and you've never found anything good against it, King's Indian attack can solve a lot of your problems. So the concept behind the King's Indian attack is that you literally put on essentially a King's Indian setup with white, but the move e6 is a pretty big concession in those kinds of structures. So it's not like a King's Indian, it's its own opening. So you play the move d3, that's how it starts. It looks incredibly lame, like why would you play d3 when you can play d4? Well, obviously the point is that you've built up your own pawn chain, and how does white continue? What is the setup? What's the next move? Now black threatens to take on e4 and force a transition to an endgame. We don't want that. So we don't want to play g3 immediately. That's wrong. If we play g3 first, black takes on e4, we take back, we allow a queen trade, and white's king has to take. That's always very awkward. It's also not knight c3. It is knight to d2. Knight to d2 is the King's Indian attack move. And now we go knight gf3 and then g3. So now we can play g3 immediately. It doesn't really matter. It's a little bit more flexible to play knight gf3 first, knights before bishops. I'll talk a little bit afterward about why we want the knight on d2, because I totally understand why you would look at this and say, doesn't it block the bishop? Yeah, and literally as I was saying that, I think people are typing this in the chat. So there are very specific reasons behind this, and they're not too hard to understand. But to understand them, you need to also understand the main follow-up setup. So let's see if we get a chance to display that. Now we go g3. Bishop e2 is also possible. That's its own setup. That's called a Hanem setup, and it's quite passive. I've never liked it. We fianchetto the bishop. We castle. So simple chess. And yeah, and he's given us a chance to showcase the way in which we generally unfurl our pieces. Now, this is a setup or a scheme which, if you don't know, it becomes very difficult to justify playing the King's Indian attack against the French. You need to know this sequence of moves. And the purpose behind the sequence is to develop an attack against black's king. So this is deceptively, it sort of looks passive, it looks very modest, but the King's Indian attack can morph into a very aggressive setup, and a lot of very beautiful games have been played. In particular, Bobby Fischer played a classic game in an Olympiad in the 60s, which perhaps some of you may have seen. That was a King's Indian attack against the French, I think. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to close down the center. So we go e5, attacking the knight, closing down the center. Beethoven, Dogus, thank you for the prime. The second thing is to solve the problem of this bishop being blocked by the knight. So perhaps you're thinking along the lines of going knight b3, but the knight's not going to be doing anything on b3. It's going to be just sitting on the queen side with no prospects. We need to find a way to route the knight somehow to the king side. And it may appear that there aren't any good squares. Who can tell me how this problem can be resolved? Yeah, rook e1, knight f1. After rook e1, knight f1, we can get this bishop to f4. And where is that knight going to go from f1? That's where the other component of this setup comes in. And I'll spell this all out after the game, so it won't be quite as overwhelming. You play h4, and then that knight through f1 goes to h2, and then to g4. And from g4, you are already ready to sacrifice, for example, on h6. But when you have a scheme, when you have a system of moves, it is extremely important to not just automatically execute the moves, but to figure out in what order they should be played. So here, if you look at this knight, where can it go? Well, it can go out to g5. So it makes sense for us to modify slightly the order of moves and play what first. What should we start with here, given this very strange move, knight h7? Of course, we should start with this move to restrict the knight. That's part of the reason, again, not to keep harping on the London system, but when you play an automatic sequence of moves, you often lose the nuance of why one move should be played before another. So if you do play one of these schematic openings, make sure that you're always asking yourself, well, maybe in this position I need to interchange the move order because of a particular circumstance. Now we go rook e1. So f5 is good. That's I like that move. Black tries to close down the king side, and of course we can't afford to let it close. We have to take en passant here. Most, 80% of times you take en passant against f5 and you take the pawn against f6 in order to keep things open. Now this square is kind of weak. This knight is really out of play, and now we just continue along the lines that I've illustrated, which is, of course, the move knight f1. This looks very, very passive. It still doesn't, if you don't play the King's Indian attack, I expect that this will look quite lame, actually. But if you give it a chance, it'll unfurl, and hopefully you'll see why it can be very, very good. Now, clearly, we have pretty much a different type of position here than I had intended, so we need to modify our play accordingly. And when he plays c5, it signals to me that this pawn on d5 has become a little bit loose. So what move comes to mind? Again, how can we modify our development to take into consideration and to exploit the weakness of the d5 pawn? We can go knight e3. Again, it blocks the bishop a little bit, but the bishop does have d2. It's not like every piece has to be developed to an incredibly active square. The knights and the light squared bishop are going to be doing the heavy lifting here. This bishop can chill out for a little while. d4, what should we meet this with? Well, thinking about the squares that this weakens, we can stick the knight on this very nice c4 square. This is a classic idea that you see in the King's Indian, and he's playing quite well. Bishop g4 is good. Now, we have a pin. We want to deal with this pin, particularly because the f file is open. I don't want this knight to be under a lot of fire. So to deal with this pin, we can't play h3. We've already played h4. We have a couple of very interesting moves here. But I think we have quite a sexy way of attacking this bishop. If you think inventively, if you're creative, rook to e4, sticking the rook on the other weak square created by the move d4. And it might be paving the way for an exchange sacrifice. If he goes h5, we are going to do our first positional exchange sacrifice. I'm really hoping that he goes h5, which is a super tempting move, solidifying his bishop on the outpost. He goes rook, queen to d7 instead. And that's a tactical blunder. That's a pretty high-level tactical mistake. Now, the first thing that I see when he plays queen d7 is, remember the fact that the queen is the worst defender. Queens are very bad at defending minor pieces because they're so susceptible to attack. And if you're very careful, if you look carefully at what the other drawback is, well, the queen is lining itself up right into the line of fire of white's knights. So I'll spare you the calculation. If I've calculated it correctly, this move just is possible. And we've had these tactics before a million times, where we're attacking black's queen. If he takes our queen, we take his. If he takes our knight, then we take this bishop on g4. It's not terribly unusual to have this kind of tactic. He does take the queen, we take his queen, attacking simultaneously his rook and also his pawn on c5. So his position begins to fall apart. Now what should we take? Should we take his pawn or should we take his bishop? Bit of a tricky question. I have a feeling a lot of people are tempted to take his bishop just because, but no. If we take his bishop, he takes with his knight reemerges from the dead, our rook hangs, and remember, his bishop attacks c2. So it's important to take c5 so that if he takes c2, which I think he will not be then attacking also the pawn on d3. And we have a moment to catch our breath, to smoke this bishop out of c2, which we can do by dropping the rook back to e2. And now we open up quite a devastating attack on b6. Okay, so he goes b6. Now, order of operations is kind of important here. Rook takes c2 is a very tempting way to start. But after rook takes c2, we give him an additional option. believe it or not, rook takes c2 is inaccurate. Because if you think for a second, does he have to play b takes c5? Did you check for intermediate moves? No. After rook takes c2, he has what move? I want somebody to find this move. If you first take his bishop, he plays rook a to c8, and amazingly, the knight is pinned. White is still completely winning there, and I'll show you the best course of action after the game in case you had fallen for that. But this can be entirely obviated if you just take the rook first. No matter what he takes either the bishop or he takes the knight, we simply take his bishop, and it's over. He can try bishop d1, intermediate move. We just drop the rook to e1. He's going to end up down in exchange for no compensation and a pawn. I hope the tactics make sense there. I'll spell them out in more depth afterward. He takes this way, which is not the best option because he drops another pawn. And now it's just very, very easy technical task. Finally, we have a chance to develop our bishop, but if we really wanted to be pedantic about this, what move would we play before bringing out our bishop? If we really wanted to be as precise as possible, we don't want to allow his rook to access either of these squares, so we would go king f1 first. Yeah, nicely done. And then we would play bishop d2 and rook e1 and all that jazz. Okay, so he attacks the rook. Rook can go to e5, rook can go to, let's go rook c7. Bring it to the 7th rank. Rook a5 is fine. Yeah, there's no reason not to snag another pawn. Just, connected passers. As long as we are sure that we develop our bishop. Yeah, so now is the time to develop your bishop. If you just fall asleep and start pushing your pawns, you allow a check on e1. There's no need for that. We have a perfectly good square here on f4. All right, so he's just starting to give up all his pawns, etc. That's why we play h4, by the way, one of the reasons. Not only did we open up a pathway for the knight, but we prevent g5. Okay, we can take another one. And let's take the knight. Now there are two ways of winning the game. The first thing that I see, we can simply push this pawn. It's not very efficient, but it's very, very simple. The second is to basically go for checkmate. To go for checkmate, you'll need to preserve this h6 pawn. How do we preserve that pawn? There's quite a nifty little maneuver here that starts with king g2 in order to activate the rook and bring it to h1. Yeah, that's just something you kind of recognize as a pattern. And I wouldn't go h7 here because of the possibility that it causes stalemate, believe it or not. So you have to be a little bit careful here. You can do a bunch of different things. I would go something like rook h4, not to belabor the point here. I'm trying to find a way to deliver checkmate. It's not that easy, though, as I realize now. So one thing we could do here is we could cut off the bishop with the move f4. And then at the right moment, we're going to go h7. But only when the moment is right. So the moment is not right yet. Let's go rook g4, threatening the rook trade. Okay, and now, you know what? In the interest of simplicity, who can tell me how we can force the rook trade? This is not the best technique ever, but how can we... What? How can we trade rooks? We can go h7. Now, it's scary to stalemate the king, but remember, he has a dark squared bishop. Our king is on the light square. He has no way to give up his bishop by force. So there's literally... Oh, God, I'm sorry to hear that. There's literally no way for him to give up his bishop. But this is only something you should do if you're very confident, right? When you're stalemating your opponent's king, you have to make sure that there is no way that he can give up his pieces by force. Resigns. Okay, we didn't checkmate black, but this is good enough. Okay. We'll take a look at Fischer's game first as a way of introducing you to the king's Indian attack, and then it'll be easier for you to understand my moves in that context. So we're going to make a little bit of a detour. This is a very famous game between Fischer and Miag Marsour. Is a Mongolian player. He's an IM. Still alive. This was in the interzonal in Tunisia. And Bobby was very much ahead of his time. He played openings that weren't very popular in his day, and he understood them very, very well. So you can see here, very familiar setup, knight d2. Bobby plays g3 first. It doesn't really matter. But just to recap, if you go g3 first, you allow the option of trading queens, which is not something white necessarily wants to allow. And the second question is, why knight d2 versus knight c3? And I think the simplest reason is that after knight c3, knight f6, you're up against the same problem as before, which is that if you play g3, black can play d takes c4. That's the simplest move. And once again, you have to force to go into an endgame, which you don't want to go into. So it's just knight d2 is the only way to make this kind of setup work. And also, if you think about the long term, this is precisely the knight that often contributes the most to an attack against black's king. It's crazy to talk about an attack against black's king, but in the main line, that's exactly what white's aiming for. No, you want black to play. Well, no, knight c3, d4 is not scary. Because to a King's Indian player, closing down the center is rarely a scary prospect. This is actually what you would want black to play. Because with the center closed, your hands are untied for kingside action, blah, blah, blah. So this is not scary. But what's scary is the sort of specific difficulty that white has in preventing d takes e4. Okay. So knight d2, knight f6. Now, Fischer's opponent plays the main line. c5, knight c6, very natural play. Black kind of plays as if he was white in a King's Indian, so you get those vibes. In fact, if black's pawn were repositioned to e5 here, you would literally have the main line of the King's Indian, the old main line with knight bd2, or knight bd7 with Carlos reversed. It is precisely the fact that black does not have time to play e5, which makes this a very dangerous setup for white, because it is white who now goes e5, as I did in the game. So e5, knight d7, and rook e1. And this game is famous because Bobby shows in sort of very vivid detail and in sort of textbook fashion how white is able to unfurl his pieces and create massive attacking chances. So how does this work? Well, black starts an attack against the queen side, b5, just like in the King's Indian. White plays the move knight f1, Bobby plays knight f1, b4. Nowadays, I think a5 is considered to be the main move. Sorry, not a6. But a5 is considered to be the best move, and black generally pushes the a pawn forward first. I won't delve into like all of the technical detail. Bobby goes h4, and bishop f4. Yeah, so h4 serves a dual purpose. The first is that it prevents g5. It might seem bizarre. Well, is g5 really a threat? It actually is. White goes bishop f4 immediately. I believe that g5 is very, very strong. You don't have that many good squares. And after g4, the knight is essentially stranded. There's no good squares either. You have to play this incredibly awkward move. And black can either take e5 or take the knight on h4 and then a pawn on h4. So it literally does prevent g5 in the first place. And in the second place, it creates this h2 square, which could serve as a transit point for either of the knights. And you often see the maneuver that I described, knight h2, knight g4, although the knight can reach that square via e3, as Bobby did in this game. Or, in some situations, this other knight can move to h2 and let the queen in. That's what I call opening the gate. There's no other way to do that. I hope that makes sense. And of course, finally, this pawn itself could be then used as a battering ram, and you could just, do the normal stuff with h5, h6. Okay, so a5, bishop f4, a4. Black tries to do what he can to attack on the queen side. Bobby plays a3. That's a nice move. It's a nice prophylactic move because if Fischer just goes knight e3 or knight h2 immediately, he was worried, I think, about creating this like Swiss cheese complex on the queen side. So this is something you will see a lot in games of the Legends, is that they will be attacking, then they'll take one or two very well-timed tempi and slow down their opponent's attack, which is an incredibly annoying thing to face. Okay. So b takes a3, b takes a3, and black continues to do what he can to try to get stuff going on the queen side. But knight a5 is a bad move. This was not very well known at the time this game was played, so Fischer's opponent, while a very strong player, was sort of at sea here, stranded at sea. And he didn't know the sort of typical ideas here. I don't actually know what the correct way of playing here for black is, but like I said, I'm pretty sure b4 is already an inaccuracy. Anyways, knight a5, Fischer plays knight e3, just as we discussed. Bishop a6, and now Bobby plays a move which I didn't mention. Bishop h3. Again, not a move you see every day in the King's Indian. What's the purpose of this move? If you look at it, you might say, well, isn't he sort of biting on granite, right? Bishop just stares at the e6 pawn, which is perfectly well defended, but there's a very tactical idea that stands behind this. If you give white another 2 moves, you could go knight g5, and already in this position, you guys should be seeing what this leads up to. You can see that a sacrifice on e6, either with the knight or the bishop, can potentially be incredibly strong. It causes black's entire pawn center to capsize, and queen h5 is strong as well. So that's sort of a secondary idea. Black plays d4, tries to prevent this from happening. Now Bobby plays a very instructive move. Why not bishop first? Yeah, bishop first is also possible. Either move, bishop e6 or knight e6, depending on the situation. Remember that you're not really going for material here. You're essentially going for checkmate. So I think the tempting move is to play knight g4. But it's tempting only because it is the only non-retreating move that's possible, but it's counterproductive given the last move because it blocks the bishop's diagonal, and it also blocks the queen's passage to h5. You don't want this knight on e3 to have anything to do with the attack so far. So Bobby simply drops it back to f1. Just knight f1. And if you think about it, this knight can later reroute from d2 to e4. The position is closed, so quite often you do have the time to sort of go back and forth and reroute this way and that way. Yeah, but knight g2, where would you go from there? Like, knight g2 seems to have less prospects than the knight on f1, at least to me. Although it's probably fine as well. Okay, black goes knight b6. He tries to get his own knight onto an outpost. And Bobby goes knight g5. Black goes knight d5. And of course, at this point, it would be extremely premature to take on e6. It doesn't do much. Bishop e6, king h8, congratulations, no follow-up. And, yeah, that's interesting, Demon, and that's probably an alternative. And bishop takes e6 is just not very impressive either. F e6, knight e6. Again, this is not in the spirit of the position. You've given up all of your attacking pieces. You've given up your fianchettoed bishop. White's king is just toast here. And look at all these squares. And look at this diagonal. So this is unthinkable. You got to be very, very careful about giving up 2 pieces for a rook and 2 pawns. It can be easy to fall in love with the rook and 2 pawns, but in a middle game, you have to make sure that you're not giving a minor piece that's very important to, for example, the safety of your king, if that makes sense. Can you go with the idea that I talked about? Well, at this point, Fischer is in a bit of a, in a bit of a tight spot because black does want to take on f4, eliminating the dark squared bishop and ruining the integrity of white's pawn structure, which is very important. So, for instance, if you were to go knight d2 here and say, well, that's no big deal, I can just take with a pawn. What's the big deal? Well, this is kind of a big deal. h6, you got to move the knight. And, this pawn hangs. Again, like, white's structure starts to collapse. The king is weak. Why allow this? Like, this is just a little bit annoying. And Bobby goes bishop d2. Again, a kind of move which some people would hesitate to play because it's a retreating move. But Fischer understands that he's got all of the ingredients in place for a devastating kingside attack. He's absolutely not shy about doing what he can to preserve all of the pieces. Bishop takes g5. I think this is another mistake. Black doesn't realize the long-term consequences of giving up his dark square bishop are severe. And you will see why they're severe in just a second. But of course, Fischer wanted to go queen h5. And at this point, sacrifices on e6 were a little bit more on the table. But nonetheless, I think that was not the most resilient move, for sure. Okay, so bishop takes g5. Of course, Fischer takes with the bishop. And queen d7. And Fischer, according to the plan that we had discussed, goes queen h5 anyway. While this does not threaten mate, it brings the queen into the game. And g6 would create, once again, the sort of Swiss cheese complex. He would go queen h6 with a lobster pincer mate on f6. So black has nothing better than to try to continue attacking on the queen side. And now comes perhaps the most important moment in the game. It's not so easy to come up with a way to continue the attack, but this is where the genius of Fischer's knight retreat to f1 comes in. Now is the time to involve the knight. Knight d2, you want to go knight e4 and then either knight d6 or even knight f6, creating devastating weaknesses on black's king side. Look at how patiently he's attacking. Black goes knight c3. That's a good try. He's trying to prevent him or discourage him from going to e4. But Fischer immediately realized that this paves the way for the game-winning tactical sequence, which is that the knight leaves d5. One of the things the knight was doing there is controlling the f6 square. Now, a very typical tactical idea. I'm sure that you've kind of seen this this pattern before, bishop f6. It's not so surprising. Black's king is all alone. This is a typical sacrifice to, to try to get a lobster pincer mate. Black doesn't take. He goes queen e8. He tries to get his queen out of desperation to f8. Fischer goes knight e4. And, had he taken the bishop after e takes f6, this threat of queen g5 and queen h6 leads to a quick mate. I suppose Black can go king h8 here. And now let me try to find the fastest path to checkmate. One moment. Yeah, here I think... Okay, who can come up with an idea here? I think I know what Fischer's idea was. It's quite a nice move. You need another piece on the king side. You just need one more piece to cooperate with the queen. And what's the piece that cooperates best with the queen? It's the knight. Well, where would you lift the rook? Queen h6, rook g8, rook e5, rook g6. But knight e4, knight takes e4. Where are you going with the rook? It's way too slow. The move is knight f3. And that's a very deep move because you're threatening both knight e5 and knight g5. And after rook g8, you don't go knight g5, allowing rook takes g5. You go knight e5, forking the queen in f7. The queen and the knight are the best tandem in chess. So it's important to recognize that when you're searching for the move. Okay, so Fischer's opponent goes queen e8. Fischer goes knight e4. And this is a dual purpose move. You want to go knight g5. But if knight takes e4, then this paves the way for a rook lift that's going to be clearly devastating. g6. Fischer goes queen g5. Nice move. Resisting the temptation to go queen h6. That would have been counterproductive due to queen f8. But now the weaknesses have been created. Deadly weaknesses along the dark squares. All that remains is a very, very simple attacking operation to open up Black's king just a little bit more. How do you do that? You go h5. It's how Bobby plays the biggest, in-your-face move ever. C takes d3 would be an automatic reaction, but he realizes that he doesn't have to do anything. You can just totally ignore everything that Black is doing on the king side and just go rook h4. He understands that the h file is about to open, and he puts the rook there in advance of that. Rook a7. Now, Fischer plays a move here. There's many ways to win. Fischer plays a move that would become very, very famous. Bishop to g2. This is a completely enigmatic move. It's entirely unclear where he's going with the bishop. Why is he wasting time on this move? And you're going to see why in just a second. D takes c2. Bobby plays queen h6. And after queen f8, a very famous move. You guys are already indicating this move. This is, again, the end of this game is very, very classic. And this also shows why he put the bishop on g2. I love these kinds of moves that set up a combination like 3-4 moves later. And the move, of course, is queen h7. H takes g6. If king g8, then rook h8 is made. And if king takes g6, finally, the move bishop g2 becomes clear. Bishop e4 is checkmate. Yeah, this is very pretty. All the pieces cooperate. And what I love about this game is how Fischer went bishop h3 in order to pressure e6 and then brought it back to g2 when it was necessary to do that. Yeah, just a phenomenal game. And of course, one could argue that Black was not particularly, how should I put it? Black's attacking attempts on the queen side were not very sophisticated. He let Fischer get all he wanted. Nonetheless, this game illustrates, I think, very well the main attacking ideas in the King's Indian attack. Okay. Now, obviously, this gave rise to 50 years of King's Indian attack theory. Nowadays, the King's Indian attack against the French is very well studied. Black has a million viable setups that all equalize and get different types of positions. So you don't play the King's Indian attack to get an advantage out of the opening. You play it to get a fresh position and to practice certain types of positions and sometimes to get very nice attacks. Okay. Transitioning back to our game, hopefully it'll be a little bit easier to understand some of the ideas through the lens of Fischer's game. And sorry if I went a little bit too fast at various points. I hope people were able to follow the general arc of the game. All right. I played the King's Indian attack against the French quite a few times with a lot of success. These ideas are valuable for the King's Indian with one caveat. White does, against the King's Indian, I've had this against Min, for example, a million times. Sometimes, but not very commonly, White will put his pawn on e3 and do something like this. And you literally could get a reverse King's Indian attack. So I've definitely faced this system before, and with a tempo down, but still the same type of position. Yeah, so it is valuable. Okay. So e4, e6, blah, 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 c5 is fine. Bishop e7 is a bit of a weird way to start the development, although there's nothing wrong with that. If white goes, or if black goes knight c6 or castles, he continues along the main line. He goes h6, which is a bit of a waste of time. It's quite a passive move. We're not trying to put our bishop on g5, and that does create a long-term hook, which we can use to sacrifice on later. Castles, castles, and e5. And knight h7 is where black really substantively deviates from the Fischer game and from the main line. If black had played knight fd7, we would have played exactly as Fischer did, rook e1, knight f1, h4. And the presence of the pawn on h6 only acts in our favor because we can sacrifice on that square later. Okay. Knight h7, we start with the move h4 in order to keep this knight in exile, not allow it to go to g5. Knight c6, rook e1. And f5 is interesting. This is something that Fischer's opponent could have played, but it's generally not a particularly good idea. It ensures that black's not going to get mated. And the reason that is because if we just blindly go knight f1, you're going to find that you just don't have any real estate remaining on the king side. Right? When the pawn is on f7, you have all this space to maneuver, but then now this knight doesn't have the possibility of going to g4. So you're operating under a cloud, and there's just nothing that white can do here. So it is very important here to take en passant, open up the position, give the rook control over the e-file. The e5 square is weak, and we can continue along the same line. Knight f1. All right. So e5 is very natural. If he doesn't play e5, our plan will revolve around seizing control of the e5 square. For example, if black plays bishop d7, we can go knight h2 or knight e3. It doesn't really matter. I would go knight e3. And then we go knight g4. And positionally, white is already dominating because we've got this bind on e5. We can go bishop f4. Then eventually we can go knight e5. And we've just got a great position. There's a backward pawn on e6. Look at how all of our pieces now have a tremendous degree of activity. So e5 from that perspective makes sense, but it does weaken the d5 score, which we immediately try to exploit. Now, d4, I think, is a mistake. I think there was no need to weaken these squares and to allow the knight such a beautiful square on c4. Now, what would you offer instead for black? What seems to be a more level-headed move? And by the way, e4 is nothing to fear, because after d, e, knight d2, the pawn cannot be defended. This is very bad as well. So you shouldn't push any pawns here. You should complete your development. With what move? Thank you, Sean Roberts. Bishop e6 is correct. And what should white do here? White has a couple of approaches. Bishop g4 blunders the bishop, by the way. But my favorite approach is to drop the other knight to h2, extending the pressure on d5, and then reroute that knight over to g4 in order to maximally increase the pressure on black's position. You also can send the queen over to h5, although I like that less, because you're not really trying to checkmate black here, if that makes sense. You just have very big pressure on black's center. This is not the kind of position everybody wants to get with white. You have to be okay with your opponent having a big center. But if you are okay with that, then you can attack it in a million different ways. c4 comes to mind, knight g4. Black's got a very hard time navigating here without his position collapsing. White is better for sure. So I hope that makes sense. Really? I'm glad to hear that. So he plays d4, we go knight c4. Now this pawn is hanging. And he goes bishop g4, which is good. And now the move rook e4 I think is quite nice, occupying the second square, weakened by the move d4. We could have also gone queen e2, intending to put a queen on e4. I think that was also a possibility. But I saw here the possibility of sacrificing the exchange, so I decided to go for this instead. Now, the move queen d7 leads essentially to a loss. You know, 5 moves later, he was dead in the water. What could black have done instead? Well, the move I thought he would play is h5. In order to cement the bishop on g4, this is technically an outpost. And here, I was going to sacrifice an exchange with rook takes g4. I haven't talked about positional sacrifices yet. That isn't a pretty advanced concept. It's an advanced concept not because it's hard to understand what it means to sacrifice positionally. It's quite easy to understand what that means. And all that it really means is you sacrifice tactically when you sacrifice for an attack or for checkmate. When you sacrifice in order to gain squares for your pieces or compensation that's more, that's more positional in nature, that has to do with piece placement or outposts or pawn structure, all of that falls under the umbrella of the positional sacrifice. And most players, including GMs, find it much harder to go for positional sacrifices because there's a greater risk. The compensation isn't quite as easy to detect in most cases, so it could backfire very, very easily. It's less concrete. Sometimes it disappears. Here, that is an exception. The compensation is not just obvious, but completely overwhelming. Where should the knight go? Beautiful square on h2, then g4. White's compensation, first of all, will consist of a pawn. Second of all, the light squares are just amazing. That bishop's going to come out to me. Look at these squares. All of the pieces are ideal. In the long run, black's king is going to get caught in a big attack. So just because you sacrifice positionally doesn't mean you don't want to attack eventually. It just means the immediate compensatory factors are positional. And perhaps the most common type of positional exchange sacrifice is one to get either an outpost for several of your pieces or one of your pieces, or to institute a bind on one of the colors of squares. You often sack an exchange to get a light square bind in the center or an outpost for a knight as well as a bind. There's a lot of famous examples of that I could give. Petrosian was famous for exchange sacrifices like that. And you can sort of see that here. So I hope this makes sense, by the way. An outpost, a square like this, which can't be assailed by pawns. Yeah, so this is totally and absolutely crushing. Now, sacrifice on h4 is nothing because black doesn't have enough pieces in the attack. We can go knight takes g4 and conveniently defend f2. All right. So I was hoping he would do that. He also could have gone bishop h5. And then we probably would have brought our queen to e1 in order to unpin and lay on the pressure on the e5 pawn. All right, so queen d7. And now knight takes e5 is a very thematic tactic. Takes, attacking the queen. He should have taken this knight. And it's not that simple here because I recognize that we have a problem. If we do this, black can go knight f6, and this rook can't go back to e4. You have to go to g6. Now black can try to trap the rook with king f7, and I didn't quite like the look of this. You might end up having to sacrifice the exchange, which is not the end of the world, but not ideal. And so what I had come up with during the game was the move rook takes g4. And after knight f6, I thought we would think on our feet here, but rook g6 seems safer here, but now there's queen f5. And amazingly, again, the rook is kind of trapped here. h5, simply knight takes h5. So, yeah, I'm not quite sure. Bishop e4, knight takes e4. So that's quite interesting. It may be that I underestimated this particular way of engineering counterplay. So I suppose one thing that you could do is, yeah, this is, you see, these kinds of things happen. You just realize that, you know, you kind of realize that you missed some sort of crazy tactical fluke at the end of the line. You could sacrifice on f6 and then take on b7. White's not going to be worse here. White has 2 pawns for the exchange. Technically, white is the one-up material. Then you could put the bishop on this outpost. White's better here. White's still much better, but that's not necessarily what I had intended. So in any case, you know, I make these kinds of calculation errors, and why did I make this error? Because I stopped calculating. This is a classic error of stopping too soon and not realizing that that rook on g4 is in trouble. What if bishop f5 instead of queen d7? Well, you tell me. Can we engineer an exchange sacrifice? Do we even have to move the rook? What would be a very savvy move, assuming that black's going to take the rook on e4? What piece do you want to bring into a position where it can get to e4 and occupy that outpost? You have a very nice positional move here if you want it. You can, in fact, sacrifice the exchange in several different ways. You can play knight f to d2. Yeah. Now, there's the direct sacrifice rook takes e5. That gives you a pawn for the exchange. On the other hand, it opens the e-file, and I'm not sure that white is the one who benefits from that. The fact that black has a pawn on e5 is good for us because it gives this rook less prospect. Knight f d2 paves the way for the knight to come to e4. This bishop could go to h3. Look at these knights. This queen to g4. It should be obvious to everybody that white's compensation, once again, is completely overwhelming. This isn't a matter of white has full compensation. White is crushing here. If you turn on the computer, I can almost guarantee you that it's going to be an advantage of +1 or more for white, despite being down in exchange, because of these massive and permanent weaknesses. Okay. So these exchange sacrifices are not like, they're not crazy to understand why. Exchange is a lot of material, but it's not like you're sacking a queen. All right. So, yeah, I was never worried about b5. It's +2? Okay. Nice. Rook f d8. Knight takes c5. And, no, black can't equalize. Black is losing. Black is losing. White's compensation for the exchange is so vast that it overcompensates by a very large margin for the exchange. You can't think of the compensation in terms of material, right? The compensation is less tangible than just saying the compensation is like worth 2 pawns, if that makes sense. Okay, so again, here knight takes f6 would have been a pitfall to avoid because, no, +1 is not a instant win because the rook is hanging and the pawn on c2 is hanging. There was no need for that. We just take the pawn instead. Drop the rook to e2, opening up an attack on b7. Okay, b6 loses faster, but he should have gone bishop to d1. And then we just drop our rook to e1, then take b7. We're 2 pawns up, totally dominating in terms of our piece placement, and so the game is basically over. The only other thing I wanted to mention is this move rook takes c2. He had rook ac8, if you remember. Let's say that you had blundered into this. How should white play this in order to get as much as possible in return for the knight? Yeah, so there's a temptation that I thought some of you would fall into, knight e6. But remember that the bishop defends the rook, so this merely leads to a trade, which is good for black because he gets a nice rook on c2. So, Botmeister, you found it. The move is b4. You want to defend the knight with the pawn so that you can get, so that you can at least get another pawn for the piece. You have 2 extra pawns and a passer, which is going to get to c6. So white is completely winning here as well. And we decided to go bishop a. There was no need for that. And so up in exchange and 2 pawns, the game is simply over here. Okay, here in this position when bishop a and white plays bishop d1. Oh, here. No, but bishop d5, rook takes d5. I would have just dropped the rook to e1. I'm glad to hear that, Botmeister. That's awesome. Why not knight e6 instead of bishop a8? Well, bishop a takes the rook. This is fine. Now, knight e6 is fine, but why overcomplicate things? Like, now it's a headache to deal with all the rooks that are hanging. You know, maybe this is marginally better, but we just take the rook and An easy way to understand this is like black is going to take 2 of our pieces and we're going to take the bishop. We've already taken a rook, so we're going to be an exchange up at the end of it. That's all good. What's the difference in a passer and a weak pawn? Well, a pass pawn and a weak pawn are like on different planes. A pass pawn could also be weak. But not all weak pawns are passed, and not all pass pawns are weak. There's just different concepts. Pass pawn is a pawn that has no pawn obstructions on its way to promotion. But the reason that the pawn on... I assume you meant the pawn on c5. Why is it not a weak pawn? Because when you advance this pawn to c6, it is permanently protected by the bishop. Black has no dark squared bishop, so black can essentially never mount serious pressure on the pawn. I think that phrase sounds sophisticated, but it's actually tautology and meaningless, like most of the things that I say, if you actually stop to think about it. But you see what I'm saying. But you got to be careful. Yeah, pass pawns can be very scary looking and also very weak. And you should definitely ask yourself that question. Oh, God. There are essentially well, no, you can be connected pass pawns. Okay. So after we did this, the rest was very obvious. King f1, I won't really comment on it. Any questions about the first part of the game? I have one explanatory segment to cement the concept of positional exchange sacrifices before we move on perhaps to one more game. I'm pretty tired. That was a long explanation. Okay, great. Let me just show you one other game segment, very famous, from Tigran Petrosian's games. Petrosian is known for his exchange sacrifices, particularly in very bad positions. That's just what he's famous for. One of the many things he's famous for. And one of his most famous exchange sacrifices. And remember, a lot of them, particularly defensive exchange sacrifices, they occur when you need to institute a bind on, let's say, the light squares. Otherwise, your opponent's going to crash through. So you sack an exchange, and then you somehow reroute your pieces to establish a blockade. So this is a very, very good example, what I'm about to show you, of Petrosian doing that with success. All right, and this is not a game that he wins in the end. He draws it, but it's a game in which he seems to be in a great deal of trouble. So I quite like this as a... it's relatively simple to understand. So he's playing Reshevsky, who's obviously not a slouch. Was not a slouch himself either. And so this is one of the most famous tournaments of all time, Zurich 1953. Bronstein wrote a super famous book about it that I think is a little bit overrated, but still is worth looking into. And Petrosian is black here. He's in time pressure, as always. They were always in time pressure. And it may not seem like black is in any kind of trouble at first, particularly because you may pay attention to the fact that the bishop on b2 is bad, but also look at this incredible pawn chain. And if you look carefully, white has just played the move rook f to e1. In the context of that move, it becomes easier to see what white is threatening. What is white threatening here? If it's white to move, what does he do? And this move just like crashes through right down the middle. e6. This just looks awful for black. Black's pieces are sort of discombobulated. The knight has no prospects. I mean, this just is awful. And it takes, and like d5, and black's getting blown off the board here. And Reshevsky undoubtedly was already sort of, you know, this is always exciting to beat someone like Petrosian. But Tigran finds one of his most famous defensive ideas to stop that, and I'm quite impressed that many of you are already finding the idea. I'll give you guys a second to think about it. Let me just make it a little bit colder. I'll be right back. Nice, rook e6, yeah. So in this terrible book, Mastering Positional Chess, I have this example. I have a chapter on positional sacrifices, and it's 63 pages long. So that was a choice I made, which sort of is rather unusual. I don't think that positional sacrifice is talked about that much in positional books. So that's part of the reason I made such a long chapter on it, because I think it's very, very important. Even if you don't like sacrifice positionally every game, it's still very instructive, I think, to observe under what circumstances positional sacrifices are warranted. So I'm using it in the defense chapter. Rook e6, double exclam. A wonderful idea. If white takes the rook, his position after f takes e6, followed by knight e7, d5, will be miserable. I mean, look at this regrouping. An incredible regrouping, but also quite easy to understand. His bishop on b2 will be a big pawn. Black's pieces will be perfectly coordinated. Therefore, Reshevsky had to find a way to try to stop knight e7, knight d5. He, like Petrosian, never panicked. Instead, he searched for ways to activate the b2 bishop. A bishop on a3 would not only stop knight e7, but also control the f8 square. Therefore, a4. So Reshevsky finds an interesting move. You know, this isn't that strong. And Petrosian finds an even stronger response. Now, Reshevsky's idea is, if he had gone b4, which is super tempting, Reshevsky had spotted a really cool idea. This pawn on c4 becomes very loose. So what little small tactical idea does white have here? What comes to mind? Now, rook c1 is too passive. It's d5, yeah. And what happens here is that the position opens up. And when the position opens up, the power of a blockade greatly reduces. That should be evident. And in particular, the exchange sacrifice is unwarranted because the files are opened. All this stuff is happening. And, you know, white's rooks are going to be monsters with so many files open. So Petrosian just ignores him. He goes knight e7 and knight d5 anyway. And he manages to keep the position relatively closed by preserving this pawn chain, b5, c4. Rook f3, bishop d3. Reshevsky, sensing that he's about to be worse, he sacrifices the exchange back. And he wins a pawn, but Petrosian with a monster knight on d5 is very, very comfortable. The game ended in a draw in 10 more moves, which are far less interesting. But basically, Petrosian has fully equalized. So, you know, that's a classic example of the sort of exchange sacrifice. This white f4. If c4, then you go knight b6, then black's going to take on e4. I don't want to belabor the point. I have one more really good example of an exchange sacrifice, less famous exchange sacrifice by Petrosian, to really hammer home the theme. We won't spend a long time on it, I promise. I will be relatively swift, and then we will move on. I think it's, but you know, it does show you how pieces really do have relative value. And it all depends on the concrete factors. You know, whether something like an exchange sacrifice would work. This is 1983. Both Polugayevsky and Petrosian were in. This was 1 year before Petrosian's untimely death. Very tragic, of course, in his 50s of cancer. But he was good up until basically his last days. So, yeah, Petrosian passed away very young. So Polugayevsky was one of the strongest Soviet players, and he was 26-25, which is very high rating at the time. So, so what to do in this position? Well, you guys, I've already set it up for you. So the move itself should be very intuitive. The reasoning behind it is more interesting, but what's the move? Do the honors. So the way that I describe it is like this. I'll read you my comment from Mastering Positional Chess because I'm too lazy to explain it again. At first sight, it may seem that the position is approximately equal. White has the bishop pair, but black has the c5 square for his knight. Petrosian asked himself the question, if I could take any white piece off the board, what would it be? The queen. The answer is the e3 bishop. The bishop holds white's position together, defends c5, and controls many important squares. Petrosian's next move shows immense positional understanding. He correctly asserts that the bishop is, in this case, more important than the e8 rook. Thus, rook takes e3, double exclaim. The elimination of the bishop is not the only reason Petrosian made this move. After f takes e3, this pawn will be extremely weak and subject to attack. Also, white's pieces will become completely uncoordinated. The b4 rook will be awkwardly placed. Of course, black isn't winning, but from a practical point of view, it's very hard to play white in this situation. So knight c5. I mean, look how easy black's plays. The dark square control is unbelievable. The rook comes into e8. And this is evidenced by the fact that Polugajevsky immediately blunders. He can try to hold his position together. Petrosian piles up on the pawn. But Polugajevsky loses his mind with rook b6. Which is an interesting idea. He wanted Petrosian to take, and then he would, I think, have sacrificed the exchange back. What did he miss? This is classic tunnel vision. Of course, he was already on the verge of panic. Knight a4, and he resigned. Of course, after queen b4, you take the rook, and then you win the other exchange, and it's very ironic that black is the one who's going to end up an exchange at the end of everything. So he wins both of white's exchanges. All right, so that's another relatively simple sacrifice, but a very beautiful one nonetheless. Classic game. Petrosian had probably 7 or 8 of these kinds of sacrifices. Okay. Oh, Sky, is queen c5... Oh, why is queen c5 not good? Sorry, I missed your question. So, queen c5 is not as good because the rook can drop to b3. And you're stealing the c5 square from the knight. Also, rook takes b7 is an additional option because, again, remember, when you sacrifice the exchange, you want to keep files as closed as possible. When files become open, the rooks become stronger, and you start regretting. And this rook on b7 is obviously very strong. But even forget the b7 pawn. More importantly, the c5 square belongs to the knight. You could also make a case for putting the knight on e5, but then it would block the bishop. You want to find the squares where every piece does its own thing and doesn't block any other pieces. And this is the most natural square for the knight. I hope that makes sense. Also, the queen and the rook then have homes on e7 and e8. If you put the knight on e5, not only does it block the bishop, it blocks a rook that would come to e8. Sorry to belabor the point, but I think it's a good question.